Welcome to everyone for joining us today online for the fifth presentation in this academic year's ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Liz Williams. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Victoria, and I'm studying environmental psychology. I'm also a member of ASRI. Today, we welcome Dr. Lynne Jackson from the Department of Psychology at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario. She will be presenting under the title Running with Horses, Reflections on the Psychology of Speciesism. Today's lecture is co-partnered by ASRI and the Department of Psychology at the University of Victoria. We also want to thank the Brooks McCormick Jr. Trust for Animal Rights Law and Policy for funding making these lectures possible. For information on other lectures in this year's series, please visit our website or see the link that Holly is posting now in the chat, as well as the email address for ASRI if you'd like to join our listserv and stay up to date with bi-monthly emails on news and events. Returning today's event, Lynne Jackson is an associate professor of psychology at King's University College at the University of Western Ontario, where she researches and publishes about psychological dimensions of issues of social justice. Her work on human intergroup attitudes and relations has recently been extended to address the related problems of environmental inequality and speciesism. She is author of The Psychology of Prejudice, From Attitudes to Social Action, now in its second edition with APA Books. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Jackson.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Liz, for the invitation. And thank you as well to Manisha for formally inviting me to connect with this group. I really appreciate the opportunity to do so. And to share with you whose work I know will enrich my own. Thanks very much also to Holly for your gracious and extremely capable guidance through the logistics to getting here today. So I'm speaking today from my home, which is close to a river once known beautifully as Antler River. My home and the university where I work are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Attawandaron peoples. Through the work that I do, and some of which I'll discuss today, I hope to contribute in some small way to healing relationships between communities of people and other beings. So I will just pull up my screen. Okay, so I would like to reflect a bit today on psychological perspectives on speciesism to provide a little bit of scholarly context. The majority of my research and writing has dealt with concerns about prejudice and discrimination in the human intergroup context, using social psychology as a frame of reference. Recently, I've given some thought to whether the lessons that I've learned may contribute to the discussions about speciesism. So today I'll share a bit of my own empirical work on the topic, but really within a broader discussion about whether and how the extant psychological study of intergroup prejudice may offer tools for understanding and tackling the problem of speciesism. I will just mention briefly for those of you who are accustomed to traditional talks in psychology that although I will share some of my completed empirical work, I will also be offering some reflections about ideas that I'm just working on now, so for which I do not have empirical support. So I have taken literally the invitation to workshop a paper and some ideas, and I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on those issues. So the reflections that I would like to share today sort of center around three general questions. What are speciesist attitudes? What are some influences on speciesist attitudes? And does work on prejudice reduction in the human context offer tools for reducing speciesism or cultivating appreciation for other species? So in discussing these issues, I'll move freely between discussing the human intergroup contexts and interspecies contexts. In doing that, I take seriously the concerns of those who have reservations about drawing parallels between human intergroup and interspecies contexts, lest it seems to devalue the seriousness of human oppression and prejudice and so on. as I know this group will understand. The parallels that I hope to draw are between the forms and functions of oppression, certainly not between the targets of it. So it is one of my many privileges that I live on a rural property along with my husband and many of our more than human friends. Included among them are 3 horses, Quito, Cali, and Numa. I like to run, and this past summer, because of COVID-19 restrictions, I was missing connecting with my human running partners. At the same time, I was aware of my equine veterinarian's comment that my horses appeared round and happy, which I think roughly translated into no real concern, but they're maybe just a little bit too round. Well, I don't ride much anymore these days, so I decided to invite them to increase their exercise by running with me. So to do so, I simply mimicked the nonverbal gestures that I see them use with one another to guide the herd's movement around the pasture. So if you'll indulge me for 11 seconds, you'll see there's Callie and Numa and Lynne. So as you can see, they accepted my invitation quite readily, and we began many summer mornings with a jog around the pond. And while running in this way, I experienced moments when I felt the boundary between myself and the horses loosen, such that for brief moments, I no longer experienced myself as Lynne doing stuff with my much loved horses. And instead, I felt a simple flow of being together in a collective and rhythmic movement. Along with the calm, meditative feelings that often occur while running, my experience of myself and the other, the horses, quite literally shifted, at least briefly, to Numa, Callie, and I moving together. So I felt sort of like I was part of an interspecies herd. And I wondered, what on earth is that? The experience bore some similarity to phenomena like flow, which is described as a complete absorption in an activity along with joy. Somewhat similar to mindfulness, or a very present, focused attentiveness, described by positive psychologists. But neither of those quite captured it. I suppose it could also be understood in relation to the construct of embodied cognition, the idea that thought is not just of the head, but an outcome of many biological processes as well. What really understood me and caught my attention was the relational nature of the experience. And in the human intergroup context, we call an experience of a shift from the experience of self to a more inclusive level that now includes others previously viewed as them, recategorization. So was this recategorization? Recategorization is a common experience that we can all relate to. For example, when psychologists, political scientists, legal scholars, philosophers, and so on turn their attention from disciplinary identity and experience themselves for a time as people or a group of scholars interested in a particular issue, we have engaged in and experienced recategorization. So from moment to moment, hour to hour, day to day, we can feel like an individual, a woman, or non-binary person, a Canadian, a scholar, or what have you, depending on the various contexts in which we operate. Well, because people tend to extend a host of good things, affection, respect, moral consideration, fair treatment, to others within their sense of we, encouraging recategorization is one tool for reducing human intergroup prejudice. For example, educators draw on the logic of recategorization when they use exercises with children that are aimed at helping children to expand their moral circle, or sometimes referred to as their circle of caring and sharing. So I began to wonder how recategorization might work in the interspecies context, to perhaps reduce what Dawkins calls the unquestioned yawning gulf that people often incorrectly perceive between humans and other species of animals. So lately I've been using the lens of a social psychologist who studies human prejudice to think about people's attitudes towards species of animals other than human. Whereas myriad isms, including both speciesism as well as problems such as racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, and so on, refer to a problematic mix of attitudes, behaviors, and systemic inequalities that disadvantage some and privilege others. Prejudice is that narrow component of the ism which resides in individual attitudes. So what is prejudice and what are speciesist attitudes? I guess my first reflection then is to query, what is the experiential underpinning of speciesist attitudes? In research on the construct in my field, which tends to be empirical, psychologists often use measures of attitudes about the use of animals for common purposes like food, clothing, and research, and so on, as a proxy for attitudes toward animals themselves. So people who report that they think it's ethical for humans to hunt, keep animals in zoos, use animals for food, and so on, would be considered to hold degrees of speciesist attitudes. We also talk about beliefs in human supremacy over other animals, the incorrectly perceived qualitative and incorrectly perceived qualitative and large gulf between humans and other species, as well as the endorsement of assigning greater moral value to humans relative to other animals as markers of speciesism. Well, the literature on human prejudice similarly depicts prejudice as involving clusters of emotional reactions to and beliefs about others. Though attempts to define prejudice are fraught with challenges. And perhaps some definitions of speciesist attitudes are open to debate as well. In the human prejudice literature, we no longer equate prejudice with endorsement of unjustified stereotypes about others, for example, because prejudice involves far more than stereotypes, emotion, for an example. And importantly, it isn't clear who gets to decide which beliefs might be justified or unjustified. Definitions that emphasize negative attitudes are too limited, as we know that contempt can coexist with love and affection. And people who consciously endorse positive attitudes may show implicit or non-conscious kinds of biases. Recently, a number of psychologists have taken a pragmatic approach and defined prejudice as any attitude that predicts or reinforces inequality. Another approach is to understand the act of defining prejudice as a political tool through which we decide which of our many biases we wish to accept and which we wish to reject and challenge. In my work on human intergroup attitudes, I define prejudice as a disrespectful attitude toward or negative evaluative response to groups as a whole or toward individuals on the basis of their group membership. And I first understood prejudice in this way at the beginning of my career when I studied the attitudinal underpinnings of gender discrimination in occupational settings. At that time, the prevailing explanation in my field was that a mismatch between gender stereotypes and the presumed requirements of high status occupations explained discrimination. Yet even then, we knew that the communal qualities often attributed to women are constructive in leadership roles. And I suspected that it was the relative lack of respect for these qualities and for women, not the content of the stereotypes themselves, that was at play in many discriminatory hiring decisions. And my empirical work confirmed this to be accurate. In the human-animal context, I wonder if respect comes close to the experiential aspect of the attitude of concern. Whatever our opportunities or constraints are in relation to animal use, for example, we are likely to be attentive to the well-being of others we respect. Also, on a practical note, in terms of promoting positive attitudes toward other species, it may be more realistic to cultivate respect compared to affection for beings we may never meet. Most people will never meet a cow, let alone a pika or a Peruvian spider monkey. Yet, if we have some respect for them as live beings, or at least respect for their role in the ecosystem, we may tread more lightly than if we lack this regard. So for these reasons, respect is what I hope to cultivate. As is widely recognized, many people love some animals and yet hold contempt for or simply disregard others. Indeed, as many of you likely are aware, that texts that address some of the psychological dimensions of human-animal relations reference these complexities with titles like Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat by Hal Herzog, Melanie Joy's Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, or a volume recently edited by Daunt and Hodson, Why We Love and Exploit Animals. Perhaps thinking of speciesist attitudes as involving a lack of respect recognizes that the coexistence of love and exploitation is a core feature of many systems in which a velvet glove of affection masks the iron fist of oppression. The specific manifestations of speciesist attitudes are many and varied, such as explicit presumptions of the lesser moral value of other species, tendencies to stereotype animals who are used for food as lacking sentience, but they all betray a lack of respect and play a role in maintaining and justifying oppressive practices. Many scholars have aptly described parallel systems of exploitation in human intergroup and interspecies relations. Social psychologists have recently taken to examining empirically the connections within and between individuals in the related attitudes and beliefs. And a sizable body of evidence now shows correlations at the individual level between prejudice against human groups and a lack of regard for non-human animals. So, for example, researchers have reported correlations between the endorsement of speciesist attitudes and ethnic prejudice, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and attitudes toward immigrants. My work shows that this correlation exists as well for the link between speciesist attitudes and attitudes toward myriad other disadvantaged groups, including Indigenous people, Muslims, elderly people, and disabled people. Further to the established observation that dehumanization, drawing parallels between humans and other animals, has served to justify colonization, genocide. Recent empirical work shows that speciesism can give rise to other common human rights concerns as well. For example, in North America, when media reports of crimes subtly dehumanized accused persons by implying that they have animalistic qualities, white people show greater punitive tendencies against racialized minority defendants. So why are prejudice and speciesist attitudes connected at the individual level? I think that human prejudice and speciesist attitudes spring from many of the same sources. And the origins of human prejudice are many, and so the sources of speciesist attitudes likely are as well. Theory and evidence within psychology suggests that human prejudice may arise in response to at least all of the following: social structural factors that shape what differences we perceive, and so who is othered; a tendency to legitimize structural inequality. As I will discuss, my empirical work shows that the way we draw on legitimizing myths is comparable across the human intergroup and interspecies contexts. Intergroup dynamics, including competition over material resources and symbolic identity value; person factors, including political and ideological orientations, adherence to traditional values, perceived threat to values; even unconscious fear of death or meaninglessness, and insecure relationship attachments. Also, biological factors have been implicated, including evolved brain modules geared toward detecting alliances, as well as threats to safety and health, and genetic factors that correspond to emotional responses that people tend to have to novelty and threat. All of these have been shown to predict human prejudice, and so are plausibly relevant to speciesist attitudes as well. So I think that psychologists are at the beginning of a journey of exploring many influences on intergroup attitudes in terms of their relevance to speciesism. My work on prejudice and also the extant social psychological literature on speciesism at this time tends to draw primarily on the intergroup theoretical approaches to understanding prejudice, recognizing, of course, that those group relations are embedded in the structural context. So I'll turn now to a discussion of some of my own empirical work on speciesism and intergroup dominance. So my work has tended to explore how tendencies to legitimize inequality and defend a self-interested status quo are characteristic of speciesist attitudes in the same way that they're typical of human prejudice. So models of prejudice that emphasize the role of inequitable access to resources in intergroup relations generally posit that when social conditions are stable, attitudes among dominant group members toward underprivileged others reflect the legitimization or justification of inequality. And such attitudes may often seem quite benign, as with paternalistic forms of prejudice, yet serve to maintain inequality by supporting traditional role allocations. So under changing or unstable social conditions, people tend to become attuned to the interests of their group. And so attitudes toward others deemed competitors become more overtly negative or hostile, and reliance on justifying myths strengthens, as with backlash against progressive social movements, for example. Of course, some people are more inclined to defend systems of inequality than others are. And in the literature on which I draw, motivations related to intergroup dominance are generally operationalized as social dominance orientation, which refers to a person's ideological orientation toward human intergroup inequality. People considered high in social dominance orientation view the world as a zero-sum competitive place and think that differences between human groups in economic and social power are natural and inevitable. And as a result, they reject the ideal of equality and instead endorse social stratification as necessary. So higher levels of social dominance orientation correlate with blatant forms of racism, sexism, heterosexism, anti-immigrant prejudice, weight bias, ableism, and opposition to human rights initiatives. Of note, higher levels of social dominance orientation also correspond with a lack of concern for the environment and a lack of concern for non-human animals. A number of theorists have reasoned that motives related to social dominance explain the intrapersonal connection between speciesist attitudes and human prejudice. In my work on that topic, I reasoned that if the basis of the connection between speciesist attitudes and human prejudice rests, at least in part, in social dominance motives, then people who endorse more speciesist attitudes ought to show a particular kind of pattern in their human intergroup attitudes. In particular, more speciesist persons ought to show prejudice against a wide range of groups who face structural and economic disadvantages. They might also be expected to show a lack of regard for persons who, by definition, aim to reduce social inequality or challenge social structures, such as feminists or animal advocates. In contrast, more speciesist persons should be unlikely to show bias against groups who are stigmatized and subject to prejudice, but not specifically and typically economically disadvantaged. I'm thinking, for example, of groups like atheists or overweight people. Based on that logic, in a couple of studies, I tested the scope and basis of the relation between speciesism and prejudice. In 2 studies, I had a total of 180 people complete surveys measuring speciesist attitudes, as well as attitudes toward about 30 other groups. And after factor analyzing the attitudes to see how they sort of cluster together, I found that attitudes tended to cluster into separate groups. So one factor included people who tend to challenge social structures, so activists, feminists, environmentalists, vegetarians, together with those who live with social disadvantage, so Indigenous people, immigrants, also people who are homeless, disabled, or elderly. So I called this factor low status and hierarchy attenuating groups to reflect the fact that they are all people who might be expected to prefer or benefit from greater equality. And as I expected, speciesist attitudes correlated specifically with attitudes toward these lower status and hierarchy attenuating groups. Attitudes toward those groups of people clustered separately from evaluations of groups who are stigmatized but not transparently disadvantaged, atheists, overweight people, for example, and separately from higher status groups like bankers, corporate lawyers, professional athletes, and so on. Speciesism did not correlate with attitudes toward those groups. Moreover, modeling showed that the common core connecting speciesism to attitudes toward lower status and hierarchy attenuating groups was indeed social dominance orientation. So whereas speciesist attitudes correlate with less positive attitudes toward a wide range of human groups, they are connected in relation to those groups' position on social hierarchy. So I think this provided some support for the idea that the motivation to preserve hierarchy is at least a part of the basis of the attitudinal component of speciesism. Based on that observation, it stands to reason that people who are committed to social hierarchies are particularly inclined to legitimize the human use of animals. And certainly this is true in the context of human intergroup attitudes. So social dominance orientation corresponds with the endorsement of many common but factually dubious systems of belief about human intergroup relations. So the idea that our economic system actually follows principles of merit, that people get what they deserve in life, that what goes around comes around, and so on. As many writers have observed, numerous legitimizing myths similarly normalize and justify the human use of other animals, especially for food. So people commonly appeal to notions of the necessity of eating animals for health, a natural or divinely inspired hierarchy, or a presumed lack of sentience or sensitivity among animals used for food to explain human eating habits and systems of food production. So while sociologists and other scholars have unpacked the role of industries and structural variables in generating the myths about animals, notions of happy meat, for example, as Sorensen talks about, social psychologists who study intergroup relations have attempted to address questions of why and under what circumstances people accept these myths. In addition to the social dominance perspective, system justification theory posits that psychological needs for order and meaning, coherence, give rise to, or can give rise to, motivations to defend and support the social system within which one lives. So according to this theoretical perspective, legitimizing myths imply that inequality between groups is fair, precisely because it's not fair. And so the system requires attention. And we can give attention to it either through social action and change, but more frequently, often more easily through psychological defense. So in support of this theoretical stance, a sizable body of evidence shows that drawing people's attention to human intergroup injustice and hence activating arguably needs for order and meaning can aggravate legitimization and increase expressions of prejudice. And that can occur even among people lower in social dominance motives. Well, one of my former students, Erin Gibbons, and I reasoned that this dynamic occurs in the interspecies context as well. We reasoned that people who are most motivated to defend many systems of inequality, that is, people high in social dominance orientation, ought to engage in the most legitimization of animal use. But we also reasoned that they ought to be especially inclined to endorse legitimizing myths about animal use, specifically when those systems are exposed for their challenging nature. So to test our thinking, we invited 82 undergraduate students to read an article that described a few normative practices about either animal agriculture or plant agriculture. The articles were fact-based, emotionally neutral descriptions of some basic steps in the production of either beef or corn. And after reading the articles, the participants completed a questionnaire measure of legitimizing myths about animal use. Our measure of legitimizing myths drew on major themes of legitimization identified in work by Laurie Hires, specifically beliefs that using animals for food, clothing, and so on is necessary, that it's justified because it's pleasurable or divinely inspired, and also the idea that animals lack the capacity to suffer. So here's what we found. What is plotted here is the level of endorsement of legitimizing myths. So as you can see, the results showed that indeed it was when the harmful nature of animal agriculture was discussed, or the challenging nature of it, that people who were most committed to a hierarchical worldview, those high in social dominance orientation, were inclined to endorse legitimizing myths about it. Okay, so this finding showed that the relation between sort of a person variable, social dominance orientation, reflective of prejudice, or a very person variable that correlates with many prejudices, and a speciesist stance, maybe contextually rooted, in that we only saw the endorsement of the legitimizing myths when there was need for defense. So in other words, the empirical connections between speciesism and human prejudice are not simply rooted in person variables, but they're rooted in how people respond to social structures. To be sure, social dominance orientation does correspond to person variables. So people who score high on it are less empathic than others. They even show lesser activation of brain regions associated with the ability to perceive pain in others than do people lower in social dominance orientation. But I think the extant literature shows that even those kinds of patterns are malleable by context, by culture, or by experiences in contexts involving dominance and power. So are there implications of this way of thinking about speciesist attitudes for constructive change? Well, by constructive change, I'm focusing on the fairly narrow question of whether this kind of work, along with other psychological work on prejudice, has clues for reducing speciesist attitudes and encouraging respect for species other than human. Legitimizing myths would seem to be a barrier to this goal, right? On the surface, the data I've shared may seem somewhat discouraging, as they show that drawing attention to injustice can backfire and cause more entrenched speciesism. But I think that this perspective actually provides both caution and hope. So on the one hand, with progressive changes, we are likely to see initial backlash in the form of renewed commitment to legitimizing myths or creation of new kinds of legitimizing myths about animal use. On the other hand, the observation that speciesist attitudes are connected to prejudice because of their support for existing hierarchies means a couple of things. I think first it means that promoting system and behavior change that address those hierarchies directly can be a powerful tool of attitude change. If we're willing to take empirical demonstrations like these as illustrative of similar dynamics at play outside of the research context, then this suggests that speciesist attitudes, like human prejudice, may be at least in part an outcome of oppression. And those who are most inclined to endorse it do so in defense of the exploitive system. So this means that the common assumption that changing social reality requires first addressing the hearts and minds of people can actually be turned on its head. By changing social structures, policies, laws, practices directly, we encourage behavior change. And this creates the context in which attitudes are likely to change. With different policies, laws, and practices, there's also a new reality to justify. Secondly, in efforts to promote respectful attitudes directly, I think these findings like this point to the importance of recognizing the structural context of our attitudes. So I guess the important question then is, how do we do that? Perhaps a reasonable question to ask is whether challenging zero-sum thinking creates positive attitude change. If people's tendency to legitimize their use of animals is a core font of speciesist attitudes, does targeting the underlying zero-sum assumptions, that is the contested idea that to benefit the self, it's necessary to harm animals, does that, just challenging that thinking, reduce speciesism? Well, if the literature on human intergroup relations can be used as a guide, I think we need to exercise caution with this seemingly rational approach. In work that I did with Vicky Esses of Western University, we reasoned initially that challenging zero-sum beliefs might be a good strategy for addressing prejudice against immigrants. So, we studied the role of perceptions of competition and zero-sum beliefs as a source of that prejudice. And there's lots of evidence that that is the case. So, though the reality is non-zero-sum, economists tell us that, immigration benefits an economy, for example. So immigrants contribute to a tax base, create jobs and invest in a country. So the reality in terms of the relation between immigrants and a host population is non-zero sum. Slightly more than half of people surveyed in North America typically report that they think that the relationship is zero sum. So we reasoned that it might be a good idea to simply talk to people about the benefits of immigration, and that would challenge zero-sum beliefs and improve attitudes. We were wrong in that that was helpful for people who already had reasonably progressive social values, people low in social dominance orientation. It wasn't helpful for people most in need, arguably, of an attitude adjustment, that is, those high in social dominance orientation. Those people, when exposed to non-zero-sum messages, dug in their heels and further affirmed their zero-sum worldview and became more entrenched in their prejudice perspectives. So by extension, initiatives that similarly draw attention to the win-win nature of a caring and responsible orientation to animals may well be quite persuasive for those on the ideological left, and so valuable, but as a caveat, not persuasive perhaps for those on the right. So is there a strategy likely to be effective for everyone? Well, in that work that I was telling you about on attitudes toward immigrants, what we found worked better were strategies based on recategorization. Okay, so by drawing people's attention to shared dimensions of identity, those who are inclined to protect their own group's interests expand those whom they include. In other words, I guess when an other can be psychologically categorized as an in-group, then both motivations toward caring and motivations toward dominance lean in the direction of defending the interests of the other. So can inclusive identities with other species be cultivated? In the work on human prejudice, we've found that many simple situational alterations, language tweaks, physical proximity, can shift people's attention to higher levels of identification and improve intergroup attitudes by reducing anxiety, challenging stereotypes, generating warmth, friendship, and so on. Recategorization is thought to be one of the mechanisms through which constructive intergroup contact can improve attitudes. So an abundance of evidence shows that when people of diverse backgrounds interact together under specific conditions, especially in the service of shared goals, attitudes toward one another improve. So constructive contact between species may foster respect through recategorization. Indeed, returning to my opening story, it was when I got off my horses' backs and ran alongside them that I felt a part of a quirky and diverse herd. Realistically, we need other strategies, as opportunities, of course, for this kind of contact are rare. So does a focus on interspecies similarities create recategorization? One approach to improving attitudes has been to cultivate perceptions of similarity across species. Undeniably, perceived similarity with other species corresponds to more positive attitudes. People show more concern for and willingness to protect species who are phylogenetically similar to humans compared to those who are less similar, for example. Also, two recent lines of research show that reductions in speciesism can be created by drawing people's attention to the many points of similarity that exist between humans and other animals. So one of those lines of work, initiated by Kim Costello and Gord Hodson, furthered by Brock Bastian and colleagues, finds that people who have their attention drawn to how other species of animals are similar to humans have subsequently reported an expanded moral circle. So those researchers report that similarity interventions lead to reduced human prejudice, as well as strengthened intentions to stand up on behalf of non-human animals and reduced speciesism. Okay, so similarity can reduce both interspecies similarity interventions create both reduced human prejudice and speciesism. And in another important line of work, Catherine Amiot and her colleagues find that both feelings of solidarity with animals and a more cognitive sort of understanding of interspecies similarity corresponds to lower speciesism and a greater willingness to engage with efforts to help animals. So those lines of research are really important for many reasons. I think that work showing points of similarity between human prejudice and speciesism in terms of intervention clearly point to the intersections of oppressions, and also points to avenues for constructive change in the interspecies context. Similarity interventions are of educational value, where in cases where people's understandings of non-humans are faulty and could be corrected with good scientific information. So I have great respect for this work and I'm grateful for it. But it does seem to me that with similarity interventions, we're faced with something of a conundrum for a few reasons. First, this paradigm achieves reduced speciesism by relying on the hierarchical ideology of human superiority. So other animals are viewed as worthy to the extent that they're like humans. Second, species differences are real. And rooting respect in similarity is better for chimpanzees than for beetles. And third, because beliefs in human uniqueness offer emotional comfort for some people, perceiving similarities to other animals can at times be threatening and evoke more speciesist attitudes. So these concerns with using similarity interventions to improve attitudes toward other species are loosely parallel to reservations that have been raised about human prejudice reduction strategies as they relate to social justice goals more broadly. When through prejudice reduction initiatives, people come to like one another more and see others as similar to themselves, they can become less attuned to real differences in social standing and access to privileges. And as a result, prejudice reduction can result in inaction where action is warranted. So is there a path toward non-anthropocentric attitude change? Certainly we can use similarity-based interventions selectively. It may be especially useful to use them, to use those in cases where people are most likely to misrepresent animals. So for example, for animals who are eaten, or to draw parallels between animals who tend to be psychologically compartmentalized. Catherine Amio talks about how, for example, pigs and dogs tend to be very much compartmentalized in our thinking. I would like to suggest perhaps a different approach. Sorry, I'm aware that we're just about out of time, so I'm just kind of skipping some stuff. My suggestion is that by drawing on the human intergroup literature for inspiration, I would suggest that we might embrace species differences, yet frame humans as allies to other beings and cultivate a higher order identity, re-categorization, inclusive of the diversity within. So my suggestion is that we use the dual identity paradigm of multiculturalism, that is, celebrating mixed identities as, say, Chinese Canadian or Jamaican Canadian, rather than just we're all Canadian, as kind of a loose guide. We know that in the human intergroup context, this paradigm has a host of benefits. It not only improves intergroup attitudes while respecting people's many valued identities, it also works better to create equality. So encouraging dual but not singular higher order identities uniquely draws people's attention to intergroup injustices while promoting engagement with protest on behalf of others. So how does this model apply in the interspecies context? I'll just say a couple of words and then we can open up for discussion. We know from several strong lines of scientific inquiry that fundamental changes to perception are possible. The way that we categorize social beings, like humans, is social. So not only do social categorizations, that is, which differences and groups we notice, differ cross-culturally, but within local contexts, they shift as a function of relationship. Evolutionary psychologists have demonstrated experimentally essentially the social construction of race is confirmed by evolutionary work. So that they've demonstrated that the tendency to notice so-called race and to use it as a background frame for social perception can be virtually eliminated with transient situational manipulations. So I would like to explore the idea that through mediums such as children's books or school curriculum, perhaps art, it may be possible to promote recategorization that's not based on a human-centered model of being, by exploring and depicting multiple higher order identities. So as just one last quick example, the use of language. Research on human intergroup attitudes with children has shown that when children are exposed to language that puts the social category first, so a disabled person, rather than the person first, a person who is blind, they're more likely to essentialize the primed identity marker and to focus on it as the attribute of interest. So I suspect that we can simply tweak how we speak about humans and other animals in educational contexts and media representations and so on to prime shared identities that are inclusive of the diversity within. Having quite recently and belatedly read Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm struck by her discussion of the life focus in the language of her ancestors, Potawatomi. She describes how the language references that we construct as entities in English, in her language, they construct as active being. So in Potawatomi, one refers to be a tree or to be a human and so on. So this to me seems to provide a beautiful superordinate life focus inclusive of diversity within. So whether finding ways to depict and express these kinds of superordinate identities will impact speciesist attitudes, as I hope they might, are certainly speculations. But I think it's fair to say that what I've learned about human prejudice leads me to be optimistic that it's possible for this unquestioned yawning gulf to be breached without relying on a human-centered frame, and for new forms of constructive and fluid social constructions to form based on communities of beings together in local cooperative and ecological contexts. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time. I would be delighted to hear your reflections.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. That was lovely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm going to start us off with a short question. And if others have questions, I ask that you please write them in the chat and we will read them off in order. And I wanted to start with what could be fairly straightforward or quite complex. In terms of the other sorts of experiences that we have with other species, and I'm thinking, for example, of people walking dogs, which is perhaps one of the most common ones that we might experience in our culture. How do you think that compares to your experience with the horses and the recategorization and the inclusive identities that we might experience as a result of those sorts of experiences in different contexts with different species?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, Liz. Thank you. I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that, because there's quite a long history of human interactions with companion animals, particularly dogs, the nature of those attitudes are quite well established, quite paternalistic in their problematic form. And so the walking of the dog is consistent with that kind of, history of relationship. So what for me was meaningful, I think, or impactful in the running experience was the real change, right? So the change from being someone who was very directive and, kind of when riding, almost using the horse as a tool, to engaging with them, as an equal interactively. So I suppose that walking with a dog could include those moments as a function of a person's focus of attention. But what changed for me was focus of attention based literally on where I was standing, and whether was I looking down or yeah. Are there opportunities for creating that kind of recategorization in sort of common interactions with companion animals? Is that kind of what's driving your question? It would be really interesting to think about, restructuring dog parks so that so that there was more direct interaction, perhaps by including equipment for play for animals and so on. So there could be, it's an interesting question. I will mull it over. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm reading a sort of question comment from Lisa that says that she said, I wondered if one could say that the horses saw you differently and included you as part of their identity as well.
I can certainly say that I was dumbfounded by how readily they accepted my gestures. They were very aware of what we were doing and very attentive. I could tell as we run, they sort of watch me. I think that they picked up on the clue. I think they picked up on the gestures as communication, which is something that I have long since tried to sort of communicate with the horses using their language, but over time I become more aware of it and better at it. And so I think their behavior is certainly suggestive of an ease of interaction using herd dynamics. So, they would not talk about it the way we do, but I think their experience probably changed in some sense based on their behavior change. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, this is from Holly. Holly said, thank you for your wonderful lecture. Your work and experience with your horse companions recalls that of Lori Gruen and Entangled Empathy, of the need to invest time with non-human animals to understand their life ways and learn their own languages. Gestures that we use as social apes would understandably be different from those used between horses in their own herds. You mentioned the nonverbal gestures that you learned and communicated with your horses to initiate the running together. Can you describe a little of what those gestures are?
Very subtle. Horses are incredibly sensitive. And so I think I've been sort of doing it to the computer, to you, Liz. I can see you. So, when a dominant horse in a herd wants to move the herd, they will sort of move their neck like that and gesture. So it's a turn of the shoulder and a move toward. That's quite literally what it was. I feel like there was a lot of richness in the question, and that was the only piece of the question that I picked up as question. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering something more substantive that Holly was raising.
Well, perhaps it wasn't specifically the question so much, but maybe you have more reflections on that too. She was talking about, I'm not familiar with Lori Gruen. Holly, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, and Entangled Empathy. And so similar to what you were describing, investing time with non-human animals to understand their life ways and learn their languages. And I think one thing that she mentions is that's particularly interesting maybe is how as social apes that we're using certain gestures. And I wonder how some of the things that you're describing would be similar or different to our experiences with other apes. And for example, I mean, Jane Goodall, of course, or other people working in those contexts as well. I don't know, any thoughts on that? I have some other questions here as well.
Scott Plous has really interesting research on empathy for different species. And, he certainly shows that the more similar the species are, as obviously great apes, with great apes we have much greater similarity than with equines and humans. We react even physiologically more strongly to them. And so I would not be surprised if, we found that the neural networks of empathy were more active and primed in those contexts as well. That's, I'm guessing, but it certainly would seem consistent with what we know about how humans react physiologically, heart rate, and galvanic skin response, and all those kind of indicators of empathy tend to be stronger for similar others.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move along here because we've got a few questions. From Manisha, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for a terrific talk and stimulating paper. How far do you think the interhuman literature can help here, given the eating of animals, and how important the food symbolism of animals is to cultural masculinized identities? Given the food difference as to how we see animals, is there room to be optimistic that change for farmed animals will occur?
Mm. Yeah. In terms of, how far do the parallels go, I view the literature on human prejudice as a springboard, and we'll see where it goes. But certainly the psychology of exploitation, I think, cuts across quite clearly whether we're eating the other or using the other for slavery purposes. It's use, it's self-interest. So I think the motivations at play are quite comparable. I'm sorry, remind me of the remainder of the question related to gender.
She was saying that eating of animals is so significant in the food symbolism in our cultural and masculinized identities, this idea that it's of eating animals, that it's so much a part of this idea of who so many of us are. Manisha, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this correctly.
It's a culture. Yeah. So, I think that dominance isn't the only issue here. There clearly there are many, dimensions of speciesist attitudes, and another one that perhaps Manisha is referring to is the deep cultural importance of food, and concerns and legitimate concerns people have about threats to their values when we take on the human-animal relationship. Julia Becker from Germany has some great work that's just come out looking at there's sort of a model of prejudice known as the dual pathways. I'm just having a moment. Essentially, the idea is that in terms of kind of broad-based ideologies that drive prejudice, sort of social dominance is one important one, but a whole other sort of set of prejudice arise from perceived threats to values, and that the kind of the psychological orientation underlying threat to values is different. It's not social dominance. It's more kind of a sensitivity to change. So people who, for example, are more authoritarian in their orientation are sensitive to change. They tend to be more fearful of change and novelty. And they show in the human intergroup context, they show a different pattern of prejudices. They're more likely to be prejudiced against groups who violate values, for example, as compared to low status groups. And so I think, certainly there is it's kind of a parallel resistance to change in relation to what I was talking about involving these values. I think what Julia Becker is showing, which is quite interesting, is that kind of threat may predict unique manifestations of speciesism. So, for example, concerns to constrain and control wildlife as compared to thinking about justifying food practices and so on. Yeah, I think that this is a really a deep and important question, and for me, I think it points to the importance of building alliances and accepting that people have different goals and different orientations toward these issues based on culture and so on, and finding those points of connection where they exist, right, and cultivating them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of just situations I've encountered, especially in environmental studies, of the strong resistance that certain cultural groups or religious groups or various contexts have to the idea that humans are animals, and that's the, I don't know if that would be specific of an example of a values threat.
Yeah, and I mean that's one of the reasons I think we need to be a bit careful with the similarity interventions, that they can be quite threatening. Yeah.
Okay, I need to catch up here on some of these questions. All right, coming from Dr. Ulrich Müller, who is from the psychology department. What about the importance of an emotional affective bond as an important factor in the development of respect? Maybe taking care of an animal would be important here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for raising that. I mean, I think of respect as affective, first of all, so when I define prejudice and potentially speciesism in terms of respect, I'm not thinking just of the kind of, elevation that we might experience in relation to someone who, we see as highly competent or as esteemed, but rather, an emotional recognition. Right. So a kind of a respect that is a respect for one, who one is. And I think that's a real emotional resonance. Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of emotional resonance is based on experience. It is conditioned. It's conditioned through simple things like having a companion animal. There's lots of literature showing that having a companion animal and a positive attachment with a companion animal maps on to other kinds of attitudes, including intergroup attitudes, and is certainly correlative lower speciesism ultimately. So I think that exploring mechanisms through which people can have these kinds of positive emotional reactions to animals that expose people to a wide range of animals, not just dogs and cats and horses, but many animals through things like indirect contact, books, and so on can be effective. And the scholarship on indirect contact, that is contact through things, shows that it's quite surprisingly effective, and that it does in terms of changing human intergroup attitudes. And part of the mechanism is core emotion. Yeah, emotional conditioning.
Great, thank you. I'm trying very carefully to listen and also read the questions that are coming. Dr. Müller says thank you. All right, so I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I think it's Mina. Mina is wondering about rats specifically, and Mina mentions that there's general agreement crossing diverse groups in society that rats are bad and need to be eradicated. And so I think this speaks specifically or quite particularly to pest animals. And so can you comment a little bit about that in terms of speciesism and perhaps re-categorization and what that means for these species that are maybe more vilified?
Yeah. Certainly, thank you for the question. Certainly much more challenging to think of recategorization for those animals for whom people often feel real contempt. I think that recategorization will, I don't think of it as something that will work through just, simple interventions like, one exposure to one storybook or that sort of thing. But, you know, I'm kind of suggesting that we think of ways of constructing our language that might bit by bit kind of influence how people really conceptualize and think about other animals. So, you know, just as an example of something that might be inclusive of a wide range of species, including rats, for example, you know, I teach undergraduate students in first year psychology. And so, you know, as is often done in courses like this, we, you know, we talk about topics like language or intelligence or motivation, emotion, focus on the human context, and then say a few words about other species of animals. If we kind of, you know, flip, you know, how we present information and think about, you know, something like, so rather than thinking about human language, and this is what human language looks like, and then by comparison do, you know, chimps have language, ultimately other species. If we think about language as an adaptation and talk about the idea that, look, this is an adaptation that helps species to engage in transmission of knowledge and this kind of thing. And this is what it looks like in the human context. This is what it looks like in you know, in the context of other species. And we sort of start to open the door for looking at things like compassion in rats, right? I mean, so you may be familiar with, you know, really interesting research showing arguably empathy and compassion in rodents, right? So then that kind of thing can be drawn into this kind of discussion. But I think it you know, it raises a really good point that it certainly is not easy to counter condition very strong adverse kinds of emotions like disgust. And Nina is quite right that rats and other animals depicted as pests tend to be exposed to some of the strongest kinds of prejudice that we have. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Stefan, is it, so bear with me, there's a bit of background to this question, so I'm going to read this verbatim. Stefan says, wondering how your research challenges some of the received wisdom around the backfire effect, Nyan and Reifler literature, which argues that most attempts to correct misinformation for topics such as vaccination, climate change, politics, will actually strengthen the mistaken belief. This is similar to the effect that you noted on correcting zero-sum information. Nyan and Reifler follow up with experimental evidence that priming subjects with confidence-boosting exercises makes them more likely to be able to listen to corrections to their mistaken views. However, your study challenges, in my way of thinking, the usefulness of their approach for animal issues because it would seem like high dominance people may not benefit from a confidence boost because they are already overconfident and looked on their place in the hierarchy fondly. Therefore, do you think it's possible to just work on high social dominance people's attitudes if done the right way? So a really interesting set of observations, and thank you very much. And I will certainly mull them over. You know, is it possible to work just on the attitudes of people high in social dominance orientation? Well, I certainly think it's well worth focusing on strategies that are inclusive of folks high in social dominance orientation, but I'm also cognizant of the power of numbers, right? And I think that, you know, working with folks who are quite interested and receptive to issues of social justice ultimately is quite a constructive approach because there is a large corpus of individuals to reach, to communicate with. And in the case of, you know, attitudes toward non-human animals, there's lots of opportunity for education. So it probably wouldn't be the approach that I would take to focus exclusively on folks high in social dominance. I don't kid myself that we're going to rid humans of dominance motives. I think that motives toward dominance are part of human nature.
And, we find ways of working with the, the complex sets of motivations that we have. So that's a little bit of a general answer, I understand, to a very thoughtful and specific question. But I think as far as a more thoughtful and specific answer, I'm going to mull that over. And I appreciate the thoughts. Yeah.
I appreciate that you're handling all this on the fly. Manisha has another question here. Whether you could clarify whether the dual identity model integrates the solidarity model or whether they are separate models.
So Catherine Amio's work on solidarity is really rooted in social identity theory, as I understand it. And so she talks about solidarity as a very kind of affective process of kind of including the other in the self. And so that would be consistent with the social identity frame of understanding the self as quite fluid. The dual identity paradigm, I think, draws on very similar kinds of goals and general ideas, sort of the idea of fluidity of identity. But I'm simply suggesting that we, use that the multicultural model as kind of as a rough model for thinking about how we describe humans in relation to other animals. So I think with the solidarity model, the focus has tended to be on looking at exposing people to information about how other species of animals are similar to the self. And what I'm trying to find is a way of conceptualizing species differences with new and different higher order inclusive identities. So something like kind of a life focus, right? A beingness focus, where we have beings human and beings otherwise. So I'm just trying to shift. I'm trying to get off that hierarchical kind of model, right? Where inclusion in the self involves kind of moving up and down a hierarchy and find new superordinate identities.
Sounds great. Well, we are at 1:50 I know it's later for you, so I don't want to take up too much of your afternoon or evening, but I'm so grateful that you've joined us today, and perhaps everyone could join me in a silent round of applause to thank Dr. Lynne Jackson for joining us today and sharing this great information. Holly is, I believe, going to be posting a poster here. And so our next lecture is on March 16th. It's the final lecture in this academic year series. And the presenter is Yamini Narahan, who's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University, Melbourne. Her title is Rewilding Caste, Visceral Geographies of Pigs, Caste, and Nationalisms in India. And you can pre-register via the ASRI website under current events. Dr. Jackson, I just want to comment that there are many thank yous in the chat, and it's been really lovely having the opportunity to hear your presentation and speak with you today. So thank you again.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.